I'm going to talk to you about two final rules, and I'm going to talk to you about them together because they're very similar. One of them is the preventive controls for human foods, and the other is the preventive controls for animal food, final rule. Both of these rules have very long names. The human foods rule is current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food. And the animal food rule is very similar, except it's for food for animals. This is a combination of our current good manufacturing practice regulations, which are now found in 21 CFR Part 110, and the FSMA requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. For animal foods, this is the first time that they will have current good manufacturing practices. As Mr. Ito indicated, the facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold human food or food for animals that have to register with FDA under Section 415 of our Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act are the businesses that are covered by this rule, which means it does not apply to farms and it doesn't apply to retail food establishments because these are types of operations that do not have to register. Now, there is one exception there in that some farms actually do some manufacturing, and those we refer to as farm mixed type facilities. So they have farming operations for which they do not have to register, and they are exempt from the preventive controls rule, but they also conduct some activities that are subject to the preventive controls rule, and they do have to register. This rule applies to domestic facilities as well as to overseas facilities that manufacture food for consumption in the United States. There are a number of exemptions and modified requirements that apply, and most of these are exemptions with respect to the requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. So I'll briefly go over some of these exemptions. Mr. Ito talked about some of these already. The first of these is for qualified facilities. These are, in essence, very small businesses, and I will come back to that in the next slide. Also, foods that are subject to our low-acid canned foods regulations are exempt from the requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls for the microbiological hazards. If there are any physical or chemical hazards associated with those foods, they would have to have a food safety plan for those hazards. Foods that are subject to our hazard analysis and critical control point, or HACCP regulations, that is, seafood and juice, are exempt from the requirements to do a hazard analysis and implement risk-based preventive controls because HACCP is so similar to the requirements for preventive controls. And we'll come back again to the difference between HACCP and preventive controls food safety plans because I know that's of great interest to you. Dietary supplements and alcoholic beverages are also exempt from the requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. Very small businesses are qualified facilities. They're exempt from the full requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls, but they do have some modified requirements. A very small business for human foods is one that averages less than $1 million per year in sales of human food, plus the market value of human food that's manufactured, processed, packed, or held without sale. In other words, food that a warehouse holds without sale. The exemption for animal foods for very small business is very similar, except the threshold is $2.5 million. Now, these facilities, although they are exempt from having to have a food safety plan, they are still subject to our GMP requirements, and they will be inspected. For a facility that has to register and that is not subject to any of the exemptions, there has to be a food safety plan. This food safety plan begins with a hazard analysis. If there are any hazards identified that require preventive controls, then preventive controls need to be established. The preventive controls need to have procedures for monitoring the preventive controls. There have to be written procedures for corrective actions for problems that might be anticipated, and there have to be written verification procedures to verify that the plan is implemented as it's supposed to be. In a facility where they have identified a hazard that requires a preventive control, then there has to be a recall plan for those foods. And then many of these facilities will have to have a supply chain program, and we'll come back to that later. The food safety plan begins with the hazard analysis. It consists of two parts: hazard identification and hazard evaluation. The hazard identification has to consider known or reasonably foreseeable biological, chemical, including radiological, and physical hazards. And these could occur naturally, or they could be unintentionally introduced, or they may be intentionally introduced for the purposes of economic gain. But remember, this is not all types of food fraud. It's only when the introduction of something could lead to illness or injury. The hazard evaluation has to include consideration of the severity of the illness or injury if the hazard were to occur, and the probability that the hazard will occur in the absence of preventive controls. For human foods, there has to be an evaluation of environmental pathogens for ready-to-eat foods that are exposed to the environment. And this is also true for some animal pet foods. For both human foods and animal food, there has to be consideration of the effective factors such as the formulation and processing of the food, the facility and the equipment, the ingredients used, and the intended use of the food. Preventive controls are measures required to ensure that hazards are significantly minimized or prevented. These include process controls, so you can think of these as the controls that have been in a HACCP plan, food allergen controls, sanitation controls, supply chain controls, and a recall plan. These preventive controls include controls at critical control points, if there are any, and controls other than those at critical control points that are appropriate for food safety. So again, a difference here in a food safety plan and a HACCP plan. The HACCP plan addresses critical control points. The preventive controls or food safety plan goes beyond that. Preventive controls are not required under two circumstances. One of those Mr. Ito told you about is when the food could not be consumed without the control being applied. In other words, even if the food were under-processed, such as the cocoa beans were under-processed or the coffee beans were under-processed, there still would not be any hazards such as salmonella as a result, because the process is so severe. Another circumstance in which a facility does not have to implement a preventive control is when it's going to be implemented by someone later in the food safety chain. So they can distribute the food without applying a preventive control, but there are conditions that apply. They would have to disclose in documents that accompany the food that the food has not been processed to control the identified hazard, and the identified hazard would have to be specified, such as not processed to control salmonella. They would also have to obtain assurances from their customer that the hazard will be controlled. The preventive control management components are the monitoring, corrective actions, and verification activities, and also the records associated with them. Another difference between a food safety plan and a HACCP plan is that all preventive controls do not have to have all of these management components. They are applied as appropriate to ensure the effectiveness of the preventive controls, taking into account the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system. So the type of controls that you would have say for sanitation of equipment that might be used for foods containing different allergens might be very different than the types of controls you would have for a kill step from a microbial pathogen. Verification activities are a key component of a food safety plan. They include, as appropriate, again, to the facility, the food, and the nature of the preventive control, the validation of preventive controls, and in general, this is going to be validation of process controls. Has to have verification of monitoring and corrective actions, calibration of process monitoring and verification instruments, product testing and environmental monitoring, and a records review, as well as reanalysis. So again, every facility does not have to necessarily do product testing or environmental monitoring. It really depends upon the food, the facility, and the nature of the preventive control. So this chart is a comparison of a food safety plan and a HACCP plan. Let's start on the HACCP plan side. You start with the hazard analysis, and from this hazard analysis, you identify critical control points to control the identified food hazards. And you establish critical limits for those critical control points. And then you monitor those critical control points. You take corrective actions when it's not properly implemented. You verify that the plan is implemented as planned, and you keep records of all of this. On the food safety plan side, it starts out exactly the same with a hazard analysis. And this hazard analysis leads to the identification of preventive controls for the identified hazards. Some of these may be process controls. And in the case of process controls, there will be parameters with minimum and maximum values, essentially the critical control points in a HACCP plan. But for other controls, like food allergen controls and sanitation controls, it may be different. The monitoring, the corrective actions, and verification are all a component of a food safety plan, just as they are of a HACCP plan. But again, the nature of those may be very different depending upon the preventive control. And of course, records are kept of all these activities. I want to talk now about the supply chain program, because this has caused a lot of confusion. Everyone does not have to have a supply chain program. Manufacturing and processing facilities must have a risk-based supply chain program to ensure control of hazards in raw materials or other ingredients when the control is applied before receipt. We refer to this as a supply chain applied control. So this means that a manufacturer is getting in a raw material or ingredient. There's a hazard associated with that raw material or ingredient. The facility is not applying a control for that hazard. Someone later in the food safety chain is not delivering that preventive control. The hazard has already been controlled prior to receiving the raw material or ingredient. And in this case, the manufacturer or processor has to verify that that control has been applied and the raw material or ingredient is safe. In the supply chain program, the facility has to use approved suppliers. The facility has to determine, conduct, and document appropriate supplier verification activities, but when applicable, they must obtain documentation of verification by another entity, because we provide flexibility in the supply chain program for the receiving facility to have someone else document some of the verification activities. We've also specified that compliance with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program requirements meets the Preventive Controls Supplier Verification requirements. And when Brian comes up to talk to you about the food safety, the FSVP requirements, then he will go into more detail about some of these activities and what's required. Supplier verification activities include on-site audits, and this is actually the default when the hazard that's being controlled by a supplier could cause serious adverse health consequences or death. Another supplier verification activity can be sampling and testing of the raw material or other ingredient, or there can be a review of the relevant food safety records to show that the supplier adequately controlled the hazard. And we've been flexible. There may be other supplier verification activities that may be applied. But again, we had a number of facilities that have very complicated supplier verification programs already in existence, and we don't want to make people change activities that are working successfully. So we've provided for other activities. The type of activity and the frequency with which it's conducted are based on the nature of the hazard, where it's controlled, and supplier performance, such as does the supplier have an FDA warning letter or import alert against it. Also, some people have been using various suppliers for a number of years, and they've had good experience, and they can use that information in determining what's the appropriate supplier verification activity and how often it needs to be done. We know that these rules are quite complicated, and we know that people are going to need help to interpret what FDA's expectations are. So we have planned a number of guidance documents. One of these is on hazard analysis and preventive controls. It's a very general document that talks about potential hazards associated with types of foods and talks about general preventive controls that may be applied for certain hazards. There will also be a guidance document on environmental monitoring, probably in the context of our industry control of Listeria monocytogenes for ready-to-eat foods. There's guidance being developed on food allergen controls and guidance on the validation of process controls. We know that people are going to need guidance on the supply chain program, both on the supply chain program under the preventive controls rules and under the foreign supplier verification program. So we're working together to get guidance documents out on those. And then, as required with all of our regulations, there will be a small entity compliance guide. Now, those were the guidance documents for human preventive controls. And as we move through the years, there will be a lot more guidance documents. There will be commodity-specific guidance documents. For the animal food side, they will start out with guidance on current good manufacturing practices, because again, this is something new to most of the animal food industry. They're also developing guidance on human food byproducts for use as animal food. We know that in the manufacturing of human food, a lot of byproducts are generated that subsequently go into animal food. And without this information that we've put in here about how to deal with that, these facilities would have had to follow both the preventive controls for human foods rule and the preventive controls for animal foods rule. But we've provided a section on the document that says, as long as all you're doing is holding these byproducts when you make human food and you don't further process them, then there are certain conditions that you have to deal with for holding them, but you do not have to apply the animal foods preventive controls rule. The animal foods preventive controls team is also developing guidance on hazard analysis and preventive controls with respect to animal foods, and a small entity compliance guide that explains the actions a small or very small business must take to comply with the rule. Mr. Ito already talked about where you can go to submit questions. If you go to our FSMA webpage and you scroll all the way down to the bottom where you see that pink box that says Contact Us, if you click on that, it will take you directly to the page where you can fill out the web form to submit your questions. They are anonymous to the extent that your email address makes you anonymous. So if you want to be truly anonymous, you may want to get a new email address that does not identify you or your company in that. The responses go directly back to the email address that submitted the inquiry. And with that, I think we're ready to take some questions. I have my team over here to help me out. So please, if anyone has questions, someone will bring you a microphone.